Hey, it works. Nice. Okay, so I'm gonna start saying quarantine for like who knows how long. It's gonna be like 1,000 hours. Okay. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Let's see how many I have already. What the heck? Oh, 21. Okay. It just went weird for a sec. Um, quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Oh, it did disappear for a little bit. Weird. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Oh, great. Why does it always disappear when I go check on it? It's weird. Oh, 65. Yay, I'm barely even a tenth the way there. And I guess that's decent, considering I've only been doing this stream for less than a minute or something. Okay, here, let's go. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Hey, it does sound like corn and tea. It's so weird. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Am I at 100? Yes, I passed 100. Okay, that's good. We good. Why am I doing this to myself? I don't know. No. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 coronavirus. Why do you do this to me? Quarantine, 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 quarantine. It gets so hard to say after you say it like at least 100 times. It just sounds so weird. What? Oh, yeah. It does. I'm just reading all of Rhett's chats, since he's like the only person who actually watches my video. Yeah, I mean, I'm torturing myself, but it's probably going to get like 4 views, so there's really no point, but I need to kill some time, so I'm just doing it. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine. Oh, how does the counter work? Okay, thank you for giving me a break. So basically I downloaded this app onto my computer that allows you to count up when you just I count up by clicking the middle mouse button, and I do that every single time I say quarantine. And then I put it onto OBS and then I crop it to that one number. And that's how it works. Oh, thanks. Wait. Did you shout out my stream? Quarantine, quarantine, quarantine. Because if you did, then that's a big good. That's a very big good. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Gosh, I hate that. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. How many am I at now? Oh, I'm past 200. Yay, that's so good. I'm happy. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. I mean, Rhett's not wrong. It just gets so messed up the more I say it. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Yeah. I'm literally just saying corn and tea at this point. That's exactly what it sounds like. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. 4 viewers? Epic. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Why am I doing this? I'm stuttering so much. It's bad. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. It really has. Like, the world's basically falling apart. And honestly, like, with all this stuff going on in the USA, we're pretty much at the brink of a civil war. So everyone's screwed. But I'm helping out here by making a pointless live stream that people can watch. I'm sacrificing my non-existent life for you viewers. Yeah. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Bruh. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, quarantine, quarantine. Quarantine, quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Oh, great. How many am I at now? 321. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Okay. I'm just gonna check how many viewers I have real quick. I'm totally not stalling by taking breaks every 2 seconds. It's not what you think it is. Okay. Videos. 2 watching. Wow, we got 2 viewers. It's amazing. No, JK, we need more. We need to get more viewers in this stream. Rhett, invite as many people as you can. I'm not doing this for nothing. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Oh, cool. I mean, at least you have friends, so that's nice. Good job. He has friends. I don't. Oof. How many times have I said, oh, come on, not even 400. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Okay, now it's 400. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. What even was that? Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Why do I keep saying quarantine? It's so... My tongue is like all over the place. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Wow, surprisingly almost halfway. My voice is already getting sore. I'm not kidding. Okay, she better join or else she is not Epic Gamer. I'm being so mean to people who aren't subscribed to me. Like, I'm just a beggar at this point. It's honestly sad. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. But I mean, what else do I have to do during quarantine? See that? See what I just did? I put it into a sentence so I could get an extra quarantine. And I did it again. Wow, I'm smart. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. I thought you were already subscribed. You weren't subscribed. What? Quarantine, 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 quarantine. You're like my second. What? What just happened? Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Wait, hold up. Rat was like not subscribed that entire time. I thought you were like my second subscriber. Okay, I'm having an existential crisis. Sorry. Yeah, well, I mean, at least I got a new sub, so epic. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Preston, thank you for joining the stream. You are now an epic human. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Preston, I'm sorry. I just have to. I'm sacrificing myself to give people something to do during quarantine. They can watch this stream. If they want to pass the time, they can just watch this stream. It's completely pointless, but I'm doing it for the people, for the children that are being bored to death during quarantine. That's why I'm doing this. Totally. No, actually, I'm just doing this because I'm bored to death. Oh gosh, I clicked the middle mouse button like 7 times without saying quarantine, so I'm just gonna have to make up for that. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Yeah, and watch time. Okay, I know that I stop in between like every 5 or so quarantines just to respond to the chats, but I mean, I want to interact with my viewers. Yeah. Can somebody say something so it can't be awkward like this anymore? I'm just staring at the camera. And I don't know what to do. Help. Oh, okay, okay. People are chatting now. That's good. Now I can say quarantine again. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. I just X'd out of my tab. Okay, let's go back. I want to see how many viewers I have. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, quarantine, quarantine. Quarantine, quarantine. Oh, 3 viewers. Okay, that's okay. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine. No, I'm clicking on random YouTube videos. What am I doing? Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Oh gosh. Nah, we're like 3/4. I expected this stream to be like a lot longer. But I guess I'm just really good at saying quarantine, you know. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Ah, ouch. I'm running out of breath. Well, the chat's dead now. I think I murdered everyone with my boringness. Not sure if that's good or bad. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Yeah, chat, be alive. The only reason I'm doing this is so other people can be on board with me. But I guess it's not happening. So I'm just wasting like 15 minutes of my life. That's good. That's good. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Wait, what? Oh. It's Rhett's special friend. Hello, Rhett's special friend. I am dying of boredom. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Now I'm going to go back to saying quarantine so I can get this over with. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Yes, it's his special friend. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Oh yeah, I'm making another excuse to talk. I just want to talk about how I have no special friends. I don't even have friends. Actually, no. I have my Alexa, and that's good enough. I'm totally not depressed on so many levels. Yeah. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Oh my gosh. Wait. How many do I have? 930. Wow. That's a lot of damage. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Oh, by the way, just so I can get a more accurate count that isn't delayed, I'm not going to be checking the chat for the rest of the stream. I'm just going to look at the counter until it hits 1,000, so I can end it right when it hits that. Or around there. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. Quarantine, quarantine, quarantine. Quarantine, 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 quarantine. All right, boys, this is going to be the last one. You ready? We're about to hit 1,000 quarantines. Quarantine. Yes, I did it. I said quarantine 1,000 times. I tortured myself by saying quarantine 1,000 times just so I can have something to do during quarantine. Okay, that's 1,001 times. That's even better than 1,000. I technically had to add that extra quarantine because I said quarantine an extra time. See what I did there? Okay, I'm dragging on. I'm stalling. I'm probably going to end the stream now. Remember to like and subscribe so you can get more pointless streams like this and other random videos. Okay, I'm running out of ideas to what to say. I'm going to end the stream now. Bye.